Okay, we will get started. And good afternoon, wineries from across Australia, and good morning, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Welcome to our Trade Readiness webinar with Wine Australia in collaboration with the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, Austrade. My name is Readiness, and I facilitate the commercial pillars of the Food and Agribusiness Industry Growth Centre, which trades as FIAL. First, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we virtually gathered here today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. For those of you who don't know, Food Innovation Australia, FIAL, we're a not-for-profit organisation that was established by the Australian government to facilitate the specific development and growth of the food and agri-business industry. These events are made possible thanks to a truly collaborative structure from different agencies in Australia and in Post. And I would like to acknowledge particularly the in-market support we are receiving from Austrade. During this webinar, you will hear from Post, in fact, 3 separate countries, and we're very lucky to have all 3 trade commissioners on the webinar from Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore today. Opportunities for the wine industry to diversify the market opportunities are critical these days. There's opportunities in various other markets, and with the impact of COVID-19, it has drawn attention to food security, which provide yet another reason why clean and green products from Australia are attractive to consumers in overseas markets. In saying that, that's just my very brief introduction, but I'll pass on to Mr. Stuart Buckley, GM Marketing Wine Australia, who will begin the session today with opening remarks. Over to you, Stuart. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. Yeah, it's great to see so many companies here today interested in exporting to Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Obviously, the markets are all suffering quite significantly at the market, so there's no silver lining, and we can't make you any promises, but the intent is really to seek out new markets in terms of the diversification following the China tariffs. We're working with FIAL and Austrade in particular under the Agri-Business Expansion Initiative. So what I want to do is just take you through a couple of slides just to give you or set the scene around some of the priority markets going forward and some of the markets where we will be working with FIAL and also with Austrade in particular. But I'd just like to thank you all for attending today. Molly, if you can go to the next slide. Look, some of you will know these markets innately. Obviously, the USA has been a significant focus for Wine Australia over the last couple of decades. Canada, British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario. The UK, we have an office in the UK, a very deep understanding of the market there, but the Nordics, Germany, and Netherlands. And then more relevant to today's conversation, the ASEAN markets, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan are really where we're starting to focus in the short term, certainly for the next 12 months, to seek out new opportunities for exporters to do business. Or to actually diversify exporters into different channels in those markets as well. So really what we're here today is to understand some of these markets in a bit more detail and to really just thank the Post for their effort and their input into today's sessions. Molly, next slide. But part of the reason we're also here is when COVID struck, we were also dealing with bushfires. The world sort of came to a bit of an abrupt halt for us. So we couldn't go to trade expos anymore. It was much harder to do business. So what we launched in April was a always-on 24/7 live expo platform called Australian Wine Connect. So at the moment, we have just under 300 exporters currently sitting in the system. It allows exporters to meet and connect with overseas buyers. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment in terms of driving connections into the platform. and that conversion strategy. So we're using social media. We're also working with the individual posts, FIAL. Part of today's experience is really to get more users onto the Connect platform and also more connections happening. The system is designed for buyers and sellers to meet online and for them to do business. Molly, next slide, please. It's been designed in order for the users to find wines, to search by region, to search by varietals, to search by price point, to search by bulk if that's even required. So there's over 2,500 different products on the system at the moment. That is increasing daily. It is already been successful in terms of exporters finding buyers. Our key KPI going forward is always to make connections and to ensure that the wineries or the exporters are able to do business and get commercial outcomes. So for anyone who's not on Connect, go and take a look at it. It is a great system. It's a 12-month program. It's 24/7. We're seeing some great results. We're seeing some great traffic flows. All of our marketing activity for Wine Australia for the next 12 months is orientated to Connect. As I keep telling my team, all roads lead to Connect. So everything you see from Wine Australia going forward in terms of our virtual tastings, our seminars, all roll through into the Connect platform. So anyone who's got any questions about Connect or interested to understand more about it, please go to the website. You can also email us at connect@australianwine.com, or alternatively reach out to myself or the Wine Australia team. So I'd just like to thank FIAL again and Austrade in particular and the posts, and hopefully you have a great session today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. And look, I'm hearing some amazing results already coming out of Wine Connect. So a great opportunity there. There is as I say, a window of opportunity, 12 months, as you said, Stuart. So don't delay and pardon the pun, but connect today, as they say. So go ahead and it's an amazing place to, even if I think these days it's just creating the dialogue sometimes, it's just getting to know, opening the door and getting to know some of these opportunities or these potential buyers and distributors and importers in other markets. So yeah, it's well done to Wine Australia for delivering their initiative. Well done, Stuart and your team. Moving on, we're going to get started today with Singapore. And we are very lucky today to have Amelia Walsh online, who is a Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner based out of Singapore. I've had the pleasure of working with Amelia in the past. So thank you for joining us, Amelia. Over to you.
Thanks, Rod, and thanks for the promotion. I'm a Trade and Investment Commissioner for Singapore, but we'll take it. Really happy to be with you all here today. Thanks for having us, and to you too, Stuart. So let's kick straight off. Next slide, thanks, Molly. I'm sure most of you know Singapore, but if you don't, its business-friendly environment makes it a really great entry point for Australian exporters into ASEAN, particularly first-time exporters. Relatively small domestic market, 5.6 million people, but a really sophisticated economy, high purchasing power, and really adventurous consumers that love new products here. COVID aside, and we'll get to that, there's usually a really strong business travel and tourism market here that really drives those food service numbers. We always say Singapore is a global trading hub, great connectivity and transshipment options. But because it's so connected to everything, it means competition here is really fierce. And so we'll talk a bit later about, how important relationships are and demonstrating your unique value proposition so you can really stand out in the crowd here. Everyone from all over the world is here. We've got really strong bilateral relationships. And with Singapore, the Singapore-Australia FTA removed all tariffs, but there are 4 categories in Singapore that attract duty. So vehicles, petroleum, tobacco, and relevant to this audience, wine. There's a calculation we can point you to online. Essentially, it's $88 a litre, but William is going to talk to you a bit more about the costings in his presentation, which would be great. Next slide, thanks. So obviously we can't not talk about the COVID piece, and Singapore's done a really great job at managing COVID-19, really with that focus on being able to open up and have that connectivity to the rest of the world to, resume their place as a major transit hub and a tourism destination. But even Singapore's not immune to setbacks, and with the Delta variant, we have gone recently back into lockdown and heightened restrictions. What it's seen is the government push forward on an even more aggressive vaccination campaign, and they're targeting 2/3 of the population to be vaccinated by National Day, which is August. And we're seeing, I think about 2 million people have been fully vaccinated already out of the 5.6. So the country is slowly opening up, but with strict guidelines, mandatory masks in public, check-in by an app or a token is required everywhere. Dining is limited to groups of 2 at the moment, which is a bit sad. We were up to groups of 8 as in part of the phased approach, so we'll get there again, but back to just date night at the moment. And alcohol consumption finishes strictly at 10 p.m. and they're very strict about that. So last year we did see a 30% decline in food service and a lack of tourism really impacting the sector, but we did see locals spending more, whether it was online delivery, cruising to nowhere, staycations, dining out. And I think, when I was giving this presentation on COVID, a couple of months ago, I would say it was really hard to get a restaurant reservation. At the moment, obviously, things are a bit different with only 2 people going out, but I know we'll get back there soon. And one thing that's really interesting about Singapore is this, now they're talking about this phased approach to basically treating COVID as endemic. So really, how do we get back to opening up faster? And I think that'll be really important. That'll be really important for food service to get kicking again. So talking about go-to-market, there's some channel considerations. We've got 3 main retailers that really dominate the market, plus your smaller boutique premium stores, which are more, catering to, say, health-conscious locals and expats. We've got food service. We've got some food service offerings that also have a retail component, which is really interesting. Some of the hotels are doing direct importing. And of course, e-commerce, which like all ASEAN markets has experienced significant growth during COVID. So that's e-commerce, say your Deliveroos and your Redmart, Lazada, but also the hotels have started doing their own e-commerce sites, which has been really interesting. There's a real appetite for Australian brands in general here. We do really well against the competition, which is nice. Buyers are always telling our team that they're interested to uncover new Australian brands. So relevant examples to this group, specifically, we had a major wine retailer ask us for wines from a specific Australian region, and another one say to us they wanted to increase their holding of natural and biodynamic wines from Australia. So that's been great. Packaging and branding matter. Locals love the story. Influencers are boosting sales online, and people are really, really interested in that brand narrative. I think we'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Molly. So you can see here the numbers around how Australia really, already enjoys really good market share in Singapore. And so just to that point, on the next slide, we'll talk about, how to think about the market in terms of gaining new market share rather than displacing your existing market share. But on this one, there are a couple of insights that we want to share with you. So it's a small market in terms of, 5.5 million people, but really strategic and high spending, especially once tourism and business conventions can resume. That's a really big focus of the Singapore Tourism Board as well. With re-export or transshipment, it's hard to get the numbers exactly, and especially at the moment, but pre-COVID, it was about 30%. And it's always been a feature of Singapore as a trading logistics hub. Consumption patterns, we're seeing about 70% red, 30% white, some increasing interest in sparkling, and about 2 litres per capita annually being consumed. Next slide, thanks, Molly. Okay, let's start with the challenges first and then move to the more fun stuff, the opportunities. I think no surprise to you that COVID has made things tough for every market, and to Stuart's point as well. Look, last year, importers and distributors were really reluctant to take on new brands. They're really just focused on supply chain and stock issues. There was a serious impacts on F&B dining in and tourism spend. The challenges, there is some brand perception in the market that all Australian wine is in that low cost category. So that's a barrier that we need to overcome as well. But on the opportunity front, this year, even with our slight dip backwards with COVID at the moment, we're getting really good feedback from importers, retailers, and our premium food service contacts that there is room and appetite for more Australian wine in Singapore. In particular, that gap's at the premium end, and we've just popped down there FOB 150 to 200 per 9 litre case, and also in the sort of sustainable, natural, organic categories, we've had a lot of interest as well, and that's across the channels. One anecdote, we met with an importer recently and a wine educator, and he told us how sad he was that some of the best Australian wine stays in Australia, and he'd love to see more of that in Singapore. So how to be successful, and we'll cover some more top tips later, but really the big one we want to focus on here is it's about, as with everything, finding the right partner is crucial, as well as investing time and resources in that relationship. On wine tastings, last year in lockdown, they were really popular. People were stuck at home, nothing to do. We've seen it continue as people have sort of got island fever and they're trapped on the island. They're willing to do virtual tastings still. But we even managed to, before this recent dip backwards in COVID, we managed to support an in-person virtual sort of hybrid virtual tasting hosted by the Swan Valley winemakers and the Western Australian government. And that was fantastic because we had 50 people socially distanced in the room, tasting the wines. The winemakers were able to beam in on the screen and really talk about the vineyards and their story. The story really matters. Media and trade really loved it. The feedback was extremely positive on the wines, but also just this, ability to actually get together in person. And I think that's one thing we can take advantage of. So during this time when people can't travel, creative solutions are essential. It also goes to Stuart's point about Wine Connect. But, what else can we do that's creative? And then when we can travel, taking advantage of being first back into market, I think will really give you an edge with those relationships. So I think that's enough from me for now, because we're going to hear from William Sear, who is Managing Director and Co-founder of the Wine and Gourmet Factory, for that real importer insight. And then I think I'm back to give you some top tips and take questions with William after he's spoken to us.
Right. Hi, everyone.
Thank you. One sec, William. Thank you, Amelia. Now, just wanted to raise just a very quick question. So, e-commerce seems to be quite large. It seems to be gathering quite a lot of momentum over there. Amelia.
Yeah, absolutely, Rod. And it's been really interesting because it's not just your traditional channels. I mean, Redmart, which is owned by Lazada, and Shopee are probably your big, grocery sort of retailers online. But every restaurant last year pivoted to an online option and started doing either Deliveroo or Grab delivery, or through the restaurant, so someone like a Burnt Ends, who's a premium restaurant in town, they'd offer a sort of a tasting menu, or, they even did wine tastings and pairings with their menu. So all of the restaurants really were thinking about how can they do an e-commerce option. And then the main hotel chains, so Fairmont and Swiss Hotel and Grand Hyatt, who are both, got great Australian brands, including wines on the books, have created their own e-commerce stores. Which has been really interesting to see. So, we say in Singapore that, retail is so important, and Singaporeans are shoppers. They love to go to the shops. They've got some beautiful flagship stores, even things like Little Farms, which has, got about 80% Australian products and some great wines too. But some people are going online only, so they're not going to the supermarkets, and that's with that nervousness around the COVID in the community. So I think having an e-commerce offering has been really essential for Singapore. And I think that's probably backed up by our other markets as well.
No worries. Thank you for that. Look, incredible opportunities in the e-commerce space. Now, we'll move on to Mr. William C., Managing Director and co-founder of various wine-related companies. To name a few, the Wine and Gourmet Friends, Wine and Kitchen, Wine and Farm. William, thank you so much for spending time with us here today. And yeah, we'll look forward to hearing from your insights on what you're looking for from Australian wines and wineries from across the country. Thank you, William.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Rod. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Right. As how should I say, as a wine importer in Singapore, there is actually, for me personally, I feel that there is a lot of opportunities for Australian wines to grow, to develop, and to expand here. And especially in Singapore, we have actually one of the higher per capita drinking in Southeast Asia. Although our population is pretty small at about 5.9%, but however, we have developed, how should I say, sort of a mature drinking, wine drinking market in Singapore. It is actually quite evident here with estimate market value for wine at about $1.3 billion, of which, of course, a lot of them are actually re-exported out regionally. And just import trading license issued is being issued to about 4,500 companies in Singapore. It is actually pretty big for a small country, small market like Singapore. Maybe the next slide, Molly. Thank you very much. Right. One of the challenges for alcohol products to be traded in Singapore is actually the alcohol tax. A lot of our customers, especially those that have went overseas or has been residing overseas and come to Singapore, they actually find that our wines, especially for sort of entry to mid-level, is pretty expensive in Singapore. Let's say, for example, you can get a bottle of really good wines in Australia for about 10 Australian dollars, but in Singapore, it would have to cost about probably $30 to $40. First, because of the alcohol tax. The calculation of alcohol tax is around here is $88 per liter of 100% pure alcohol, right? So let's say for 14% alcohol, if you do the math, okay, it's about $9.24. Besides that, we do have a GST, which is 7% on the value of the goods being sold. And there are plans, actually it's almost confirmed plans to raise it to 9% in 2022, right? Apart from that, we also have very high operating costs in Singapore, especially things like the rental, the labor, and the logistic costs, and so on, all this as well. So all this actually adds up to giving, how should I say, the selling cost of the wines are pretty quite high in Singapore. If the wines are of entry and mid-level, of course, if the wines are of a more premium level, then all these costs will be a bit more negligible, especially for alcohol tax, because the alcohol tax is based on the alcohol percentage rather than the value of the wine, right? Molly, sorry, next slide. Thank you. So we can see that the advantage of the Singapore market is that there's a maturing and educated wine drinking culture here. Especially if you provide them with more information, you provide them with stories and background of the wines, talk to them more about the wines, and usually the consumers down here, they are very interested to try them out. And especially in Singapore, a lot of Singaporeans have high disposable income. And there is a very huge increase for the past 10 years in terms of wine education channels. We have WSET. Previously, we have Australian Wine Plus. Right now, we also have a French Wine Scholar, certified wine specialist from the US certifications. All these actually are offered to industry and non-industry people. And also, most importantly, these programs, many of them are supported by our Singapore government. they do actually provide grants, for people. Let's say, for example, even non-industry people, we have the Skills Future Grant given by our government to actually attend all these courses to upgrade ourselves. So with all this knowledge that comes in, our population, our people in Singaporeans, they are more willing to learn more about wines and spirits, and then go out and try something new rather than the mainstream branded products, right? And also in Singapore, the drinkers are actually quite online tech savvy. They like to use, I mean, in my shop, in my cellars, in my restaurants, I see them use a lot of Vivino, to a lesser extent, Wine Searcher and Cellar Tracker, to actually, search more information about wines before they try the wines, they purchase the wine. That is why for us as a retailer or a sommelier, we have to actually keep on upgrading ourselves with all these courses to be ahead of Vivino, and especially Vivino, right? So that the customers will actually listen to us and then trust us and have confidence in us to how should I say, pick up our recommendations. Social media in Singapore, especially for the millennials, like Facebook, Instagram, and especially Telegram in Singapore as well, plus TikTok, is extremely important, right? Because in Singapore, especially the younger generation, they spend a lot of time on all these social media. And when there are interesting content and all this, like let's say, for example, some interesting videos, creative, how should I say, designs and all this, the consumers are more inclined to try out and more inclined to share with their friends on all these channels, about all these channels. The other one is there is still a lot of Singaporeans subscribing to wine critics channels like James Halliday, Wine Advocate, Wine Spectator, and Jancis Robinson's to actually get their information about the wines that they are going to purchase, right? The other big advantage about the Singapore market is I personally view it as a very big gateway to the Southeast Asian market. That is why in Singapore, with the collaboration of the Singapore government, they and this big logistic company called CWT, they actually created Southeast Asian biggest wine hub, okay, in the free trade zone called Singapore Wine Vault. It's a $700 million warehouse, bonded warehouse to store duty-free goods. And when you visit the wine storage area, you can actually see companies from different Southeast Asian countries actually store wines, right, in that wine hub. In not only just that Singapore wine hub, but also other bonded warehouses, so that if there's any need for wines in their own country, they will just ship it out from there, right? And of course, in Singapore, I mean, Singapore itself has a very close proximity to Australia. A lot of Singaporeans actually studied there, visited there, and have a lot of relatives there. So we sort of have a very strong affiliation to actually Australian wines as well, because whenever we go to Australia to study or to visit, we tend to, the first thing that we requested is actually, one of the first things that we requested is actually go and visit a winery in Australia. Yeah, so we have a lot of exposure on the Australian wineries and Australian wines over that side. And finally, the most important thing is that there's a common English language between Australian wines and in Singapore, because English is our first language here. So there's a ease of understanding the Australian wine label. Whereas if we talk about the German wine label, the French wine label, the Spanish wine label, right? At many times, we have customers that actually ask us, what does this word means? What does, for example, they have the appellation, let's say Macon Village from Burgundy. They don't know what is Macon Village. They will ask whether it is a grape, whether it is a wine producer, and then things like that. So it is something which, how should I say, they need more effort to go and understand the label. Whereas for Australian wines, it's much more easier, and so it's much more approachable for the how should I put it, our local market, right? And of course, just now Amelia has mentioned, Singapore is a very competitive market down here, and it is a very small market down here, and you have other wine producing countries, how should I put it, have an ongoing aggressive marketing campaign. Like, for example, Italy, for the last 5 to 8 years, they have been campaigning through Win Italy very, very aggressively. And also they have things like Gambara Rosso and all that to actually promote Italian wine. That is why right now in Singapore, the number one, in my opinion, the number one wine being consumed is actually Italian wines, right? Followed by the French, which is actually marketed very aggressively by Sopexa, Isaacs by Spain. And all this is happening even during the pandemic period. So let's say, for example, Win Italy, they actually appoint Singapore local ambassadors to actually spread the word of the Italian wines among the local population, the local consumers, and it actually works very, very well for them, right? And of course, they are also very aggressive pricing strategy, especially for Italian and the Spanish side. A lot of the Italian and Spanish wines, you can get actually FOB, let's say, for example, FOB for Italian wines, you can get about $1 to 1.5 euro per bottle. So if you come to Singapore, it is actually very, how should I say, low cost. Plus, usually these wines, the alcohol percentage is lower. It's about 12%. And it actually will build up to very much lower alcohol tax. And overall, the wine prices will be low in Singapore, right? And this is especially important because wine is still being viewed as a luxury product in the Singapore duty culture, because due to the relative high taxes, and all the other expenditures, right? So what I would say, I can skip the next few things. So maybe I can go to the next slide, Molly. Right, so the current perception of the Australian wines right now is that many of them are actually entry to mid-level at the moment in the Singapore market. One of the main reasons is because most of the specialized wine retailers, they are focusing a lot on the European wines, like the French, like the Spanish, and the Italians, right? And that many consumers actually sees the Australian wines being more dominant in the supermarket, right? And in the supermarket, right, you have actually shelf rows and rows of Australian wines. It's not, I mean, they are actually very decent and very high quality wines as well, but it's just that in the supermarket, usually the prices are much more competitive. And this in turn, how should I say, give the consumer the perception that, oh, Australian wines are actually more on the low cost range, right? And also because of that, the more premium wines in, how should I put it, the more premium Australian wines, it needs more convincing, okay, for the local importers to bring them in. And then local importers also need more incentives to actually try to promote all these more premium wines. Things like probably we need more tasting sessions, and this can be supported by more samples from the wineries. And also we probably will need a long-term marketing campaign rather than just a short-term. I mean, and the long-term marketing campaign, I would mean that it might probably takes about maybe 2 to 3 years time. Yeah, so to have that consistency, right? Currently, the most recognized Australian wine regions are number 1, Margaret River and Barossa Valley. Anytime you ask any Singaporean, 70% of them will actually say, oh, Australian wines, Margaret River or Barossa Valley. All right. Of course, there are some other recognizable ones, easily identifiable ones are the Coonawarra, Yarra Valley, and Hunter Valley. Right. But for me personally, there are wines from Orange, there are wines from Pemberton, there are wines from Swan Valley, Swan District, and all this. They are amazing. Tasmanian, I love Tasmanian wines. right? They are all really, really, really amazing, right? And I believe that they are all underrepresented in Singapore, and we should have, how should I say, more marketing campaign to shout loudly for all the regions in Australia. I mean, Australia itself is a big continent, very diverse wine regions with very diverse climatic condition. You know, you have many, many different styles of wine that will interest a lot of people in Singapore. And especially Australian wines are highly acceptable and approachable among Asian palate. Because of the food that we eat, it's usually very flavorful, very flavorsome. We use a lot of sauces, we use a lot of herbs. You know, we have a lot of flavors in our food. And because of our diverse culture, we also have a very diverse styles of food. So with Australian wines, you know, you have fruit-driven wines, you have elegant wines, you know, you have, you know, wines with a lot of freshness and things like that. It can actually blend very well in the different kinds of food in Asia, right? But however, there's one last thing that for the past 10 years, actually, there is some incidents that actually affected the reputation of Australian wines. For example, one very big one is actually the fall of Australian wine index in Singapore. It actually causes quite a bit of losses among Singapore investors in wines, or Australia wines, and there are companies actually that takes the opportunity, not say the any opportunities that actually take the downfall of Australian wine index, bought a lot of how should I put it, premium wines from them at cutthroat prices and release those cutthroat prices at very, very competitive prices into the market. Let's say, for example, Elterton Command, all right, is a very high value wine initially, but because of this incident, a huge volume is being released in the market at 50% off, that means half price. And it actually devalues the wine to a point whereby the sole agency in Singapore decided to give it up, right? Because it sort of spoiled the market and they are unable to make a sustainable profit out of it, right? And maybe the next slide, Molly. Thank you. Right, so my last slide is actually on some suggested focus that we can help to improve the, how should I say, the import of Australian wines. The first one is actually education on Australian wines. This is actually a proven and very successful program that has been done before 2010. Right, so there was Australian Wine Plus back then. Wine Australia actually invited our our wine educator to AWRI to attend courses so that they can bring back the knowledge back to Singapore and educate the industry people. And in turn, the industry people will educate the customers and all that. So this was actually very, very successful. In my own opinion, 2010 before, it was so successful that every time we talk about wines in the market, there are many times the consumer will actually ask for Australian wines instead of Italian or instead of Spanish. Okay, and there are quite a number more companies that has been set up to focus on Australian wines. I even met up with people that set up companies that focus on Clare Valley wines, that focus on Barossa Valley wine, or focus on South Australian wines, or Margaret River wines as well. Right, so it was very, very successful back then, and I hope that this can be continued and then enhanced in the, how should I put it, in the coming marketing campaign for Australian wines. The other one is actually romanticize Australian wines. As compared to, no offense to other wines from other countries, but as compared to other countries, I find that Australian wines are very, very colorful. You have a lot of stories, you have a lot of, how should I put it, background, history, family stories. You know, they can even create a story out of sheep, out of goats, you know, out of movie characters and all these. And it actually interests a lot of people in Singapore, right? There are, how should I put it, there is a wine, I remember there's a wine which I spoke to Amelia about it in the supermarket, which Amelia brought it up. It's about some of the more notorious people on the label. on the wine label, and it was actually very, very well received. I have a lot of customers asking for that wine, right? So this one, you have a lot. If you have very, very interesting stories and things like that, it helps a lot. And of course, we need to do something to reignite the love for Australian wines, right? In the past, a lot of people grew up with Australian wines. It's their first love. It's a lot of them is the first wine that they drank, right? Because it's easy to understand, it's approachable, close proximity of Australia to Singapore, and Singaporeans travel to Australia a lot. So it is something that is, especially for the baby boomers, right? It is something that actually is ingrained in us, and we only need to light the match. We only need to reignite it, and people will start going back to explore more of the Australian wines, especially right now. There's so much more different styles coming out. You have the biodynamic, you have the organic, and all this, and natural wines as well. And of course, because it's easy to appreciate and all that, we should also focus on the younger generation. Just like in the past, for a lot of us, it's the first wine that we drank, right? And when it is the first wine that we drank, like we keep on going out, we will always go back to the story that, oh, this like Duin Estate or Penfolds or this Wolf Blass and all these are the first wines that we drank, and it is amazing this how I fall in love with wines. And of course, my advice to the wineries is to have a multi-tier wine selections. What do I mean by that? Is actually you have the entry level, then you have the mid level, and you have the premium level. I understand that some wineries, they don't have, they probably will focus only on certain range. If that is so, probably they can actually collaborate or go in partnership with other wineries and come up with this full range together. Reason being is, especially for the more boutique wineries, when you come into the Singapore market, right? Because of the competitiveness with wines from other countries, it's best to actually have something simple, entry level, to attract our local consumers. Price point is one of them. So, let's say, for example, if I go to drink wines most of the time, probably I won't choose in Singapore, I won't choose $80, $90, or $100 bottle of wine. I will start off with probably $20, $30 a bottle first. And then from there onwards, I build up my interest up the tier, right? Together with education and the recommendation by the wine specialists or sommeliers or the retailers, right? So this is what I meant. Have different tiers and progressively move the consumer up the tiers. One interesting thing about wine that I observe is once the consumer move up the tiers, very seldom they will come back down. So they will stick to the more of the premium once they reach there, right? And of course, like the Italians, how should I say, being Italy, you can actually appoint Australian wine ambassadors in Singapore, right? A lot of the wine specialists or professionals, they are not looking for how should I say, monetary gains. They are actually more looking for passion. They are actually very passionate, and they are looking more for recognition and things like that. So you can actually just appoint them as a wine ambassadors, and constantly share with them knowledge, satisfy their passions and all this. And in turn, they will actually share it with other industry people, and even share it with non-industry people. So it will actually increase the base of the Australian wine drinkers. And lastly, of course, social media plays a very, very, very big part in how should I say, in marketing of the wines right now. And especially a lot of time, the wines are being sold online. Just a quick share, beside Lazada and this Shopee that Amelia just shared, one of the big online wine retailer is actually the Changi Airport Group, right? Because right now there's less flight. So Changi Airport Group, they actually leverage on their 1.3 million subscribers to actually sell wines online. And because my wines are listed in Changi Airport Group, And wherever we send the wines to the warehouse, you can see every day there's 3,000 over deliveries of wines and spirits across Singapore. In other countries might seem small, but in Singapore it's actually pretty big, right? And across the supermarket, the retailers like Sheng Siong, Cold Storage, and NTUC, because of their online platform contribution, wine sales actually increased by about 34 to 37% during the pandemic period. So it actually plays a very, very big role. And social media actually contribute a very big part for consumers to actually take that click, to buy the wines online, right? So I think this is the last of my slides. So if there's any questions, feel free to actually let me know. Yeah.
Thank you so much, William. They're amazing insights, and wow, it sounds like a very complex market, and this pricing is very complex too. Sounds like you have that good, better, best. You really need to have a niche, and you need to be very clear on your price points, because yeah, pricing obviously plays a very big part in on the consumer's side on whether they're going to buy a boutique wine or an entry-level wine from the supermarket. So it's very, very interesting. Thank you, William. Look, we're only going to have time for a couple of questions, because we don't have a lot of time for the Q&A part of the session for Singapore, but we're getting a lot of questions on price. And one of those questions, or majority of the questions around pricing, William, from your perspective, if you are looking to enter the Singaporean market and you're looking to go to different channels, so we're talking supermarket or food service or so on and so forth, what is your recommendation? Is your recommendation to have a label for the supermarket and a different label for the restaurants, for the more boutique products, for the food service element? How would you recommend to wineries across Australia? What is the best way of entering that good, better, best tiering that you mentioned during your presentation?
Okay. Yeah, Rod, that's a very, very good question, and you actually got it right. It's best to actually have different labels for different segments of the market. Like for supermarket, one label. For what we call on-trade, that means restaurants and eateries, you have another label. Because in Singapore, the market is so small, our high density area. So it's like the restaurants usually won't want to lease in any wines that is easily being seen in the supermarket or the convenience stores. So entry level, you talk about pricing. Entry level, we are looking at about 30 Australian dollars to 60 Australian dollars FOB per dozen. And then if we talk about the mid-level, probably about $80 to $150. The higher level, probably about $150 onwards. And we have this ultra premium level, which probably we are looking at about $200 or $300 FOB per dozen. Yeah, so these are the range that we are looking at.
Wow, okay. Other questions coming through on supply chain logistics. What are the challenges with COVID at the moment in the supply chain in Singapore?
Currently, supply chain is very challenging right now because for us, when we import our wines, we realize that the logistic costs have actually doubled. Is one thing, or even tripled in some cases. Second thing is there's not a lot of shipment going in and out of certain countries. Like maybe it's like, for example, if we talk about Australia, probably every week, in the past, every week I would have one shipment coming out from Adelaide. But it's like available to us from Adelaide. But right now is probably we will have to wait. There might be only twice a month or even once a month. There was a period of time that's only once a month out of Adelaide, and we have to wait very, very long for the wines to reach us. This another thing. Apart from that, once come to Singapore, actually the process is still pretty fast. Yeah, it's all about the shipping, the freight.
No worries. Thank you, William. And Amelia, a question for you, and we'll wrap it up because then we need to move on to the next market. But Amelia, I'm getting a few questions on how can Austrade help emerging exporters or new exporters that are looking to get their product out there and doing some samplings or for Austrade to put it to run some events in market so they can sample the different varieties and products from different wineries from across the country. Is that an option, and how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to do something like that. And I think, if you already have an Austrade contact in Australia, speak to them about it. I know some of you are already working with Austraders in Australia, or maybe, you can get the word to us through your TradeStart contact or through Stuart's team, or you can come to us direct. So there's a number of ways you can work with us. And actually, normally when we do these kind of presentations, we sort of pop up a slide about all the ways you can get to us. And maybe, Rod, what we can do is we can share that with you after this so that you can get it out to everyone who's participated today about all the ways they can come into Austrade.
No problems at all. And if it's okay with you, William, can we share your details with the audience when we send communication to everyone? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
No problems. No, thanks again. Look, some amazing insights, and thank you again, Amelia and William, for your time. And now we are moving on to a different part of the world. Thank you. On to Malaysia. And we're very lucky to have Paul Sander, Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner to Malaysia. He's based in Market, and he will provide a presentation on the opportunities and what is happening right now in Malaysia. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Rod, and thanks to Molly and the team at FIAL for the invitation to be part of today. It's a great opportunity. Thank you all the wineries and representatives for joining us today. I will not take the stage for too long because it's important to hear from our friends Nigel Wong and Mr. Yap Lip Sum because they will really attack some of the opportunities and the challenges and give everyone a good feel for the Malaysian market. I suppose the first thing I would say, I should mention I'm also joined by my colleague Casey Liu, who looks after our F&B and agribusiness work in those sectors. So for the tough questions, you can always talk to Casey about that. First thing I would say is please don't discount Malaysia as a strong market for Australian wine. Despite the fact that there is a large Muslim population here, because Australian F&B more broadly, Australian wine is extremely prominent. It's prominent in the supermarkets, it's prominent in the stores, and it really is front of mind for many Malaysian wine consumers. There's room very much at the premium end to do much more work in the market in terms of education, and still some strong opportunities despite the difficulties and the challenges at the moment. Just a couple of points on Malaysia itself. Despite the ongoing lockdown with COVID, we've had sort of lockdown light from most of the beginning of the year. We're now in lockdown heavy with considerable restrictions on movement, considerable restrictions on the hospitality industry, so only takeout at the moment, with many restaurants closed. Hotels, as one example, the Mandarin Oriental here in KL Central has current occupancy levels of 8%, to give you some idea of the challenges in the hospitality and the hotel sector. More broadly, however, despite that, it's envisaged that Malaysia will actually reach a 4.5% growth in 2021, which is astounding considering the current environment, but really some significant challenges. Generally, if you look at the Malaysia political and economic overview, population of 32 million, but about 30-35% of those potential wine consumers Ease of doing business. Generally, things are pretty good. There are some challenges with the bureaucracy and with registration timeframes, but overall, it's a pretty easy place to do business. I'll just mention FTAs. Again, really they provide a really strong framework. There's a patchwork of FTAs that apply to Malaysia and Australia, with 99% of Australian goods tariff-free into this market. Really, to echo some of the sentiment that my colleagues and William have already talked about, high penetration of digital engagement and growing. Social media, extremely important in marketing. E-commerce, rapid growth over the last couple of years, but it was a growing trend even before COVID. So Malaysian, very, very savvy on e-commerce, and for the future, that's where we'll see, again, strong growth. Next slide, please, Molly. So I mentioned some key points around the recovery, the hospitality sector. Overall, distribution channels have been significantly impacted by the pandemic, and we've seen double-digit decreases in total volume sales. Although, in saying that, Australian product has maintained really stable trade values in compared to some of the other players in the market, Argentina, Spain, France, Italy, etc. Sales via e-commerce also have increased as a channel for purchases by consumers, but it's still coming off a very, very low base. So the significance of that, we shouldn't overestimate on that. In terms of general opportunities, I mentioned that we think there's a lot more work that can be done at the more premium end. Generally, Australian product tends to be at that entry level, the lower price points up to the medium. Echoing William's point on the difference between the channels in terms of supermarkets and food service and hospitality, obviously more premium and more brand awareness at the in the hospitality and the food service area. Next slide, please, perhaps, Molly. So just a few points you can see there on the screen about the necessary for the regulation of alcohol imports from the Malaysian customs. There's also a point there that you can see on the sales and services taxes that have been implemented since September 2018, excise tax and that 15% volume tax and import tax. If you need more information, we can certainly give you specifics. The next slide, we'll talk about some of the excise taxes. So you can see generally there where we sit in terms of the different products with still wine, sparkling wine, and obviously spirits. I should say also that for many of you on the call with spirit manufacturing, that we believe there is a small but growing interest also in spirits from Australia because of the very, very strong branding, provenance associated with that, and the difference that we have to many of the more traditional Irish and Scottish providers in the market. Next slide, please, Molly. So Singaporean friends touched on some of the things that we can be doing, similar to Malaysia. Lots of interest still in doing virtual tastings, sometimes combined with food pairing. We can do that. We can assist to get through samples into the market to the actual distributors and to the players in the market. There is a bit of a time lag there in terms of the registration of samples and new labels, but we would encourage new entrants into the market. We're always happy to look at new brands to talk with some of our contacts about the right channel and the right distribution partners. Reiterate again, really important to think about marketing strategies, and a big part of that still for Australian suppliers is education of the consumers, the wine, enhancing that wine drinking culture, making sure that we really do talk about the provenance, talk about the stories behind the brands, as William has said, and once commitment to that market, to Malaysia, back it up with strong marketing, strong social media, work with influencers and wine personalities in the market to really sell the story of your brand, but also the story of Australia more broadly. Thanks, Molly. So I think we don't need to go through too much of the top tips. I've sort of talked about that. But we'll certainly leave it now to Nigel, who will talk a little bit more about consumption trends and consumer preferences. And then we'll hear from Mr. Yeh also, who's in a really great position as within his seat of the Malaysia Association of the Hotels as CEO, there to talk to you more about the dynamics of the market. So I'll leave it there, Rod and Molly, thank you, and hand over to Nigel now for more specific information. Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you.
Hey, Paul, and hi, guys. Nice to be online with all of you. I'll just get straight to the meat of the matter. So thank you, Molly. Next slide, please. Just a quick introduction about us. We formed the Australian Wine Co. in Australia. So my business partner and brother, who is currently unable to make it, is also signing up as an exporter, and we actively source for wines, boutique wines in particular, around the country. We've set up Australian Wines in Berhad here in Malaysia to market specifically craft and boutique wines. Just a bit of history about us. My brother is a chef, and he graduated from William Anglis in Melbourne, did some time there in Sofitel and the oil rigs, and he's back in Malaysia now, running a restaurant and promoting Aussie wines. I, on the other hand, come from a very different background. I'm actually a software engineer with Monash University. We both lived there a total of more than 20 years, currently very active in the travel and tourism industry. And wine, naturally, of course, is just a natural extension of that industry for us. And of course, later on, my partner in crime as well, Mr. Yap, who is also the CEO of the Hotel Association, will give you a little bit of insight into what the hospitality industry is currently like. Next slide, Molly, thank you. So most of the insights that have been provided by our colleagues in Singapore and by Paul, of course, is very similar to what we were going to present. So I won't repeat a lot of it. They're very accurate. We share a lot of common challenges and common strengths with the Singapore market being so close to one another, with a few key differences, which I'll get to in just a few minutes. So just to set the context of the discussion, we're actually quite proud to say that for many years, Australian wine imports have been at the top of the list. As you can see from this chart, recent figures that we obtained from customs, you can see that Australian wines in 2019 were in the region of about 37 million USD or so in terms of imports. And even though 2019 and 2020 saw a decline because of COVID-19, we're still right there at the top. So what it basically says is that compared to a lot of other markets, France being the closest competitor, Aussie wines are still very much in the minds of the general consumers. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the trends of consumption and the sort of education we're getting here in Malaysia. First and foremost, Malaysia being an Islamic country, of course, doesn't really allow for alcohol importers or merchants to really advertise their products in a big way. And most of the drinking demographics are found in specific cities, mostly along the west coast of Peninsular Malaysia. On the East Coast, it is it's more rural, made up more of Malay demographic. And of course, we've got on the Borneo side of Malaysia, across the South China Sea, we've got Sarawak and Sabah. Sabah, of course, being a big tourism hub, will also have a slightly larger base of consumers when tourism was active. But mostly in the west coast of Peninsula, in major cities such as Kuala Lumpur, Johor, Penang, and of course the duty-free island of Langkawi, which Yap will actually give you more information on in a while. Now, compared to Singapore, we have about 7.2 million Chinese and roughly about 2 million expatriates, most of them again based in the capital city of Kuala Lumpur. That's actually much bigger than the total population of Singapore put together. Now, what this means is even though out of that 7.2 million Chinese alone, and we're not counting the other non-Muslim ethnic groups, the percentage of drinkers is relatively small, but the per capita spend per consumer is actually relatively high. Now, what this simply means is there is massive growth potential, especially because the millennials who are, most of them who are educated overseas and have come back to Malaysia, are used to the lifestyle, are used to drinking things like wine and spirits. So again, there is a massive growth potential here, and Australian wines tend to feature very prominently in the minds of these young drinkers. Now, unlike Singapore, the perception of wine here is still very strongly tied to cultural norms. So for my colleagues here who are in Malaysia, you'll probably understand it when I say that, Chinamen, to use the term loosely, all right, they drink nothing but red wine. It's in their blood, it's in their culture, it's a mindset that hasn't really changed over the many years. And this is particularly so with the older demographics of drinkers, right? And in a way, some of these cultural norms are being passed on to the younger drinkers. For some reason, red wine features prominently in their minds. Yet there is a growing, although gradual, awareness of of other types of wines, particularly white. And a lot of wine importers here are slowly getting into gear and pushing rosés, for example, which I think in Hong Kong already is quite a bit of a fad with the rosé revolution going on there and in a few other countries. Now, in terms of education, one of the major programs that is really taking shape and gathering momentum here is the WSET program. The attendance is very consistent, and there are actually a good number of younger participants which are signing on, right? And this is not just trade professionals, but these are young professionals who are interested in understanding more about the culture of drinking wine. Now, in terms of education as well, because of the restrictions here in Malaysia, there is a lot of word of mouth advertising that goes on. And this is evident from a large number of community groups set up on social media channels like Facebook, informal groups through WhatsApp and Telegram, and of course, pre-COVID-19, a lot of informal gatherings between enthusiasts and wine lovers in restaurants or in private events. Finally, the good news is that wines are becoming the norm at many events, not just weddings, but banquets, corporate events, and replacing generally spirits, or it's coming up there, all right, and getting equal attention to where spirits used to be the alcoholic drink of choice. Next slide, please, Molly. Now, just a little bit about the consumer preferences and market entry variables here in Malaysia. Again, very similar to Singapore. The only difference, of course, is in terms of the ability to spend. Singapore's spending power is much higher, and of course, that influences the type of wines that the local market generally focus on here in Malaysia. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, most people prefer to consume reds, and not because of any other factor. It's not because of health, it's not because of taste preference naturally, it all boils down to perception. And this is something that we're going to have to change if we want to expose the market to a wider variety of product. Now, the sweet spot here for wines is below 100 ringgit, or basically after tax, between Aussie dollar 15 to 32, right? And this again comes back to the younger generation of drinkers who are out there, the catchy labels, interesting names, and flavors that they can easily relate to, right? Now, there is a good demand for premium wines though, although like our colleagues in Singapore have correctly mentioned, there is still that mind block where people tend to see Australian premium as not the best value premium wines. And this is something that we're going to have to change in the local drinking mindset here. Now, just a little bit about bubbly. In Malaysia, I'm not too sure about Singapore, there is a very high excise and duty for bubbly. I do not know why, but it just is. So champagne being one of the more popular bubblies, they're very expensive, but again, very popular to the premium market, especially at events. Right? Now, just a side note here, our excise and duty structures are fairly similar to that in Singapore as well. So like Paul has actually presented earlier on in his slide, we're generally looking at roughly the same excise and duty of about roughly 8 Aussie dollars and upward for lower level entry wine. So that's about about 26 ringgit, all right, per bottle, moving upwards. Now, new drinkers tend to start new world here. Again, very similar to Singapore demographics, and Australian wines are normally at the forefront of their thoughts, but they generally tend to gravitate towards old world wines as they become more seasoned drinkers. Now, the older drinkers or even the newly matured drinkers tend to go for very popular wine varietals, for example, Bordeaux, Burgundies. In Italy, they tend to go for really strong, heavy-bodied wines, and that's generally, again, a perception issue, right? Now, older drinkers tend to gravitate away from Australian premiums, and the perception of drinkers here are heavily influenced by one, culture, and number two, knowledge. So this is where we think that there needs to be a lot more effort, very much so like what the spirits industry is doing. They are very strong when it comes to spirit ambassadors. They pour money into branding and awareness, and they really try and position their drinks as something that will cater more to the millennials of this age, and they're doing very, very well. So this is something in the wine industry that we eventually like to see. Next slide, please, Molly. Now, in terms of branding and promotion, my colleagues have really touched a lot about online sales. Our feeling here is that yes, in the future, once COVID-19 is more or less behind us, there will be a trend that will continue where people will continue to buy wines online. But in Malaysia especially, we're a very touch and feel kind of community. So we look at the industry gradually rebalancing itself, maybe even quicker than we expected. Once restrictions are removed, restaurants are allowed to open, hotels are allowed to operate, and eventually once tourists are allowed to come back into the country. So while we see that there is potential to sell wines online, we do not foresee the Malaysian market as really shifting en masse into this medium of purchasing. They will still go back to their traditional places, restaurants, bars, hotels to have their wines with their foods. Now, of course, advertising is very limited due to local regulations and restrictions. It is an Islamic country, so we can't really advertise out there. What we do need, though, is more awareness programs, and this is really, really interesting. We did a couple of virtual tastings. The graphic on the right is one of the tastings that we've done with a winemaker, and the theme was wines of provenance. And what we did was we actually got the winemaker to come on board virtually via Zoom. We had ready stock here, which is very important. We can't actually conduct a effective tasting online, all right, without product to give out and to taste. So we did a hybrid. I think Casey was there, and I think he had one too many bottles of wine. But what we did was we had a hybrid session where the winemaker joined us via Zoom. We then gave out small mini bottles of samples, which we had to do on our own. It was shipped out on the same day. We even had a chap Zoom in while he was driving and said, "Hey guys, we're on Zoom. I'm driving. I'm going to pull over and we're going to go and do this whole virtual tasting." We told him, "Don't drink and drive. You're Australian. You should know that." But at the end of the day, it was successful because we did see immediate requests for sales. There was an awareness of this new winemaker, and we've seen residual sales continue since that event took place. So again, just to boil down to 2 key points in terms of awareness, we do need the winemakers to get involved because the story and the romance behind the wines make a huge difference in shifting perception in favor of Australian wines. Secondly, it would be really nice to have not just the winemakers come on board, but the samples on the ground, and it's all about the touch and feel factor. Number 3, there needs to be a bit more community engagement. So while importers like us tend to do our own work with the community, it would actually be far more effective if the winemakers themselves, through the local importers or through Austrade or a similar body locally, start to engage the community to raise awareness of Australian wines in a number of different ways. Now, last but not least, again, back to the touch and feel factor, it's very important that the industry in Australia get behind the importers here and distributors here by having a physical presence in the country. Now, unlike Singapore, where there is an abundance of variety available and the demographic is different, it's far more educated, Malaysians and even Malaysian businesses need to have that additional education and experience in order for the wine industry here to see a significant uptake in the next few years. Now, just to give you an idea, we will be working with the Food and Hotels Malaysia show at the end of the year in December to organize probably a wine and spirits show together with a B2B and B2C component. We're going to try and get a lot of people in. And of course, we will be working closely with our Australian counterparts here at the end of the year in anticipation for borders opening up in 2022. In terms of the Food and Hotel show, my colleague Yap may choose to elaborate a little bit more on that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Juan. Thanks. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to share. We're very excited to see more Australian product come in, and there are a large number of suppliers and distributors here, and we're wishing you all the best, and we hope to see a lot more interesting stuff come out from down under. So thank you very much, ladies and gents.
Thank you, Nigel. And again, Nigel is the founder of Strine Wines and Secretary General of the Malaysian Association of Tour and Travel Agents, MATA. So thank you, Nigel, for your insights. And we're going to move on to Mr. Yap Ling Sung, CEO of the Malaysian Association of Hotels, who will provide his insights on the hospitality trade. Over to you, Mr. Yap.
Thank you. Thank you, Rod. I'm just going to touch quickly on the hospitality industry, and we look at the star-rated hotels. The reason we want to touch on star-rated hotels is because we know clearly that the 4- and 5-star hotels has more F&B outlets in the hotels, and these are the high consumption of wine. These are where the wine consumptions are. So in general, every 5- and 4-star hotels will have their range of different wines, from the house pouring wines up to the premium ones. And we see a lot of presence of Australian wine in the hotels, because that's where you get a variety of wines that you can actually offer to the clients. And hotels in general will have a higher holding power in terms of having more wines, more stock that they can offer to their guests. So in the recent years, even just in the past couple of years, we have seen a lot of premium brands coming into Malaysian market, the St. Regis, the Ritz-Carlton, Four Seasons, the W Hotel, Hard Rock, Banyan Tree, even the one and only is now in Malaysia. So that's a signal that they will be going for a lot of more wines, and of course the premium ones. Next slide, please. Okay, let's look at the F&B component of the hotels. In general, we use 2019 to compare because 2020, because of the pandemic, we are very much affected. If you look at 2019, the component of revenue, 63% is generally the rooms revenue, whereas F&B revenue is 33%. And within the 33% of F&B revenue, we have a breakdown of 79% on food and 11% on beverage. That's relatively still very low, but there's a potential to grow that, of course, now that the trend is here and people want to dine with their wines and have a drink with it. And if we calculate backwards based on the tourism receipts from the accommodation sector, that comes to about R1 billion in beverage sales a year. And that's where the potential is. And we are catering to, in 2019 itself, we were catering to about 26 million tourist arrivals. And of course, a big portion of that are actually from Singapore. And whatever Singaporeans drink in Singapore, when they come over to Malaysia, they will drink in Malaysia as well. That's a good market. Can I have the next slide, please? This was actually presented by Nigel earlier. The same trend we see in terms of imports into Malaysia, the same trend we see in the hotels. This is typically the consumption of wines in the hotel at the same rate, at the same ratio, where Australian wines are on the top of it because of the volume. And if we have Australian wine as a house pouring wine, and that will be the highest volume of the consumption there. Previously, we see the demand driven by pricing. People go for cheaper wines regardless of where they are having it. If they're going to buy from retail or they're going to have in a fine dining restaurant in a hotel, the first thing they look at is the price. But then over the years, we see that trend moving towards personal preferences, varietals that they want. People, as they get educated, they have more awareness on what wines are, and they will demand for something better, and they are willing to pay a little bit more. So that goes in line with the growth of hotels in Malaysia, and the demand will grow along with it on wines. Next slide, please. This is a very special market that, as what Nigel has mentioned earlier, we have a duty-free market in Malaysia, and it's confined to the island of Langkawi. So Langkawi is a very special market, and it has a highest density of 5-star hotels in Malaysia per area. And with that, drives the demand of premium wines as well. Duty-free wines are generally about 30 to 50% cheaper than the ordinary market. But of course, you can have the wines in Langkawi, but to take it out, you have to stay for 72 hours, and you can take only maximum 1 liter. But because wines are generally just a one-off consumption, those purchases that goes out of Langkawi are usually spirits because they cost more in the mainland. So Langkawi has a very confined niche market of wine consumption. I was based in Langkawi for 4.5 years in one of the hotels, and in general, there's one winemaker, at least one winemaker dinner in the island, in one of the 5-star hotels, in one of the luxury restaurants every month. So we can see the trend there because it's driven by not only the population, rather small population, 110, 120,000 people in Langkawi, but we have a large population of expats in Langkawi. And also we have a lot of people coming in on the luxury yachts, and their boats are coming into Malaysia. They go through Langkawi to have the premium wines. So that's a good market for us to reach out to. We see a lot of importers in Langkawi. They import a lot of premium wines into Langkawi, and that's where the consumption of the premium wines are as well. So this is a very interesting market in Malaysia, or the duty-free market, that many has not actually touched on this. I think we have a good opportunity of growing wine consumption in Langkawi itself. That's the last slide that I'm going to present. Just a brief overview of how the hotel business is looking at the moment. We are looking at about 15%, as I think Paul mentioned earlier. Mandarin Oriental is doing 8%, but across the country, the occupancy now is about 15%, 15. We are looking at closing the year of 2021 at only about 23%. So it's still very low. We are looking for the recovery next year, of course. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, some amazing insights once again. And I'll very quickly get on to some of the Q&A and some of the questions because we're running behind on time. Nigel, just we'll start off with you. Couple of quick questions. One of them is in Malaysia, screw cap or cork? What's the preference?
Interesting question. There is no real preference. The only thing again is perception, which is not really a big thing at the moment in terms of cork. There really isn't a major difference. There is more romanticism when it comes to pulling a cork out of the bottle. But thanks to Australian wines, I think screw caps have become quite the norm here and people are generally quite used to it.
Nigel, would you say that the more premium, more boutique wines are the ones with the cork?
In general, yes. And I think on that note too, people tend to appreciate corks for the more premium wines. It does add that little touch, you know, when drinking a more premium wine. It's an experience thing.
And on the labeling side, what is the preference? I mean, obviously there's regulations on labeling, but do they consider the product more premium if the labeling is still in English, or does that make a difference at all?
Well, again, like William did say before, you know, the one plus point for Australian wines is the labels are in English. So again, the labeling as far as Australian wines is concerned is perfect. It's great. I really wouldn't change a thing about the Australian labeling at all.
Great, thank you, Nigel. And Mr. Yap, on the hotels, due to COVID, of course, the number of tourists and hotels, people staying in hotels obviously is down. But when do you see Malaysian tourism and hotels and that whole hospitality trade, when do you think things will get back to semi-normal in Malaysia?
We're looking at this year end for us to restart the domestic tourism. Again, domestic tourism is a different ball game altogether. Lower spending power, mass market, and the domestic market will be the key driver for the next 1 year at least. So for international market, we're looking at 2023, the earliest to come back to norms. Not even coming back to norms, actually, just for a reasonable recovery on international arrivals. That will be 2023.
2023, okay. No worries. And one last question. With samples, and I'll leave it open to both yourself, Mr. Yap, and Nigel to answer this question. But on samples, I know you mentioned earlier on that it's best to have samples on the ground where possible, if possible, to have obviously a distributor or have a presence in country. But what is, from your perspective, if you're looking to get into different channels, whether it's retail, whether it's e-commerce, or whether it's hospitality, is the first step from your perspective to send through the samples and to engage directly, or is best to go through a distributor? I'm assuming that at the moment, distributors is probably the best way to go because you're unable to travel, and there is virtual tastings that you can obviously do these days. But I'd love to hear from both of your perspectives, what is the best way of engaging, the first step of engaging with a new prospective customer?
Okay, maybe I'll start first and then Yap can chime in. First of all, the regulations here make it very difficult for anybody to send wines direct. For example, we tried to get some samples recently and they were delivered via FedEx. And unfortunately, the winemaker made the mistake of delivering or sending 3 bottles in one package, and we were charged a huge amount in terms of excise and duty and related costs. But the worst part wasn't that. It was actually, they wouldn't allow the wines in unless we went through the whole bureaucratic process of applying for a permit, right? So again, to answer your question there, it would still be best to work through the importers, all right, and the distributors, because they're already well set up and they've got their way of getting things moving smoothly on bringing wine samples in, even though it's in smaller quantities. Secondly, of course, the distributors and importers already have their channels, their markets. So it's far easier for them to say, hey, look, there's going to be some new samplings. Let's conduct an event. We've already got our target audience. It's a captive audience. We've got our retail outlets that are willing to participate. And it's just a matter of saying, we've got the samples, we've got the program set up, and let's go, we hit the ground running. So again, in short, to answer your question, much better to do it with the assistance of a local distributor or importer. Yeah, I don't have anything to add on that from the hotel side.
Yes, I think I just want to add on the hoteliers' perspective is that we enjoy going to shows, food and hotel shows and wine shows. For every show that we go to, not only in Malaysia, we go to Singapore for FHA, we go to Hong Kong for OFEX, we go to Shanghai for Food and Hotel China where Pro Wine is. I think that's one very important engagement point. Distributors or importers or winemakers needs to be present at these wine shows to attract hoteliers where they will reach out and they can actually try and look at the wines and even negotiate on the spot itself. That is a very good engagement point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for your time today. There's lots of information there, and yeah, look, if it's okay with both of you, can we share your details with the audience today? Is that okay?
More than happy.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we are flying away from Malaysia and going off to Indonesia, and we have Miss Hannah Wade, Trade Commissioner, Austrade, Indonesia. She's Hannah. Here we go. There's the slides. Hannah, thank you again for your time. Over to you.
Thanks, Rod, and nice to be here to speak with everyone today. And I will try and go a little more quickly as I know we're sort of short of time. So bear with me on that. Molly, next slide, thank you. So just to provide, I guess, some key points, many of you would be, quite familiar with the Indonesian economic landscape. It's probably worth pointing out, though, it is the largest economy in ASEAN and a big player globally. But interestingly, in 2019 welcomed 16 million foreign tourists, and I think that's something I'll pick up later on in terms of target market for wine and premium wine in particular. It is obviously a very large population as well, 264 million people. The World Bank does categorize, however, only about 52 million of those as forming a middle class and a small proportion of upper class. So it is important with some of these markets to really understand the size of the actual target market for some of, in particular for wine. The only other thing I'll point out on this slide in particular is the rise of digital platforms, incredibly dynamic digital landscape in Indonesia. Everything's fast delivery through Grab or through Gojek, and YouTube and WhatsApp and Instagram have in many ways replaced websites for traditional companies, and it's absolutely vital to have these types of platforms in entering Indonesia. Thanks, Molly. I'll go to the next slide. So important to note, as many of you may have seen on the Australian news, I know it's quite prevalent at the moment, the daily caseload for COVID-19 is very high in Indonesia at the moment. We've been hitting more than 20,000 official cases per day for the last 10 days, and there is citywide restrictions currently in place. What I would note more broadly, though, is that there have been significant impacts to food service, which really is the main channel for wine since the start of the pandemic. So there have been a variety of different allowances, but for a long time, restaurants were at 50% dine-in capacity. Currently, there's no dine-in, it's takeaway only during a more significant restriction period we're going through at the moment. But because tourists haven't been allowed in from any countries during the pandemic for quite some time, this has really impacted that premium hospitality, high-end hotels, and some of the big tourist centres like Bali. So there has been a really, really significant impact for wine sales as a result. There has been a rise in e-commerce during the pandemic. However, this was a smaller channel. Drinking at home isn't really the, cultural norm for Indonesians who do consume wine. It's really more around enjoying food with friends, creating celebrations, being out at a nice restaurant and matching your food with your wine. So while e-commerce sales from our outreach to sellers in market have ticked along and been able to support ongoing operation, it certainly hasn't taken off like has for beauty products, for example. I'll talk about the distribution channel in a later slide, but one thing I do want to note is there is restrictions on advertising, I think, like was mentioned for Malaysia. It's not possible to advertise broadly on TV or those types of channels. So really having an Instagram page or having a presence on e-commerce is one of the key ways, but it is required to have a physical presence in market first. So the presence of brands on e-commerce is really through their importer and retailer channels specifically. Retailers do use WhatsApp though and have lots of loyalty programs where they send out, you know, discounts and things directly to their consumer base via WhatsApp. So what are the opportunities in Indonesia? There is a consumer interest in trying new things. There's a real engagement with things related to pop culture. For example, Korean food is incredibly popular here because of the rising K-pop. And so some of the trends around drinking wine is really driven by interest in other cultures and Western trends. I think was mentioned for another market, there's also a fairly sizable student alumni of students who have gone and studied in Australia and have returned to Indonesia and are interested in continuing to, you know, see familiar brands that they may have enjoyed in Australia. There's also quite an established Australian market share for wine, which I'll touch on the next slide. On the challenges, some of these are quite well known. There is a product registration process through the Food and Drug Authority of Indonesia, BPOM, which includes quite strict labelling requirements and can take between 6 and 12 months for each product category. And a change in your import actually means doing that process all over again. There are quotas that importers need to apply for in order to be able to bring product in, and there is strong international competition as well as very high tariffs, which means that realistically a bottle that is sold in Australia for $10 is probably more likely to be up to 3 times the price in Indonesia. Next slide, thanks, Molly. So to go a little deeper into some of these key insights, it's really the trend here and the opportunity for Indonesia is capturing rising disposable incomes from an increasing middle consumer class. Half of the population is actually aged under the age of 30 in Indonesia. However, the traditional key target markets will still probably remain for at least the immediate future key points of interest, and that does really focus on foreign tourists, expats and high net worths, obviously all very impacted at the moment by the COVID pandemic. One thing to note is Hannah,
we're having issues with your audio. We lost your audio, Hannah.
I'm back.
You're back now. Yes. Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. Dropped out for a second. Yeah, so I was just saying there is a local presence of locally created wine as well as herbal wines, non-grape wines. But this sort of consumer adventurous spirit is really pushing up the sale of imported wines. As I mentioned before, many new or millennial consumers are introduced to wine through restaurant experiences and food. On pricing, it is a very competitive market, and we do see some real traction being gained by Chilean and Argentinian wine, as well as local Indonesian wine, which is becoming increasingly more sophisticated. Thanks, Molly. Next slide. So I think this is really interesting. Australia actually has quite a good market share and was top in the last 2 years prior to the pandemic. With 37% of the total imported market share. What's really interesting is that due to the price sensitivity and Indonesian consumers, you know, really seeking that middle range of wines, you do see a dropping of the old world wines previous dominance. So you see dropping statistics from France and from Italy, but you do see an increase in Australia, but also notably from Chile and from Argentina and even from South Africa off a very low base. this does mean, though, that at the moment Australian wine has a good recognisable branding to affluent consumers and tourists, perhaps less so, though, to new consumers. And we do see an opportunity for education for those new consumers coming online for the future. One really important thing to note is that prior to the pandemic, we were seeing Indonesian distributors really actively expanding the networks into smaller cities, looking to add new brands, working with importers, particularly around that mid range of pricing. However, we have very, very limited, if no interest at the moment from those importers and distributors in taking on new brands, given their given the situation of the pandemic. Thanks, Molly. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, the market entry is a little complicated into Indonesia. There is only a small number of importers that are permitted to import alcohol categories, and they operate under very strict procedures and requirements. So finding an import partner who is willing to take on a brand is really probably the number one and perhaps hardest step. They're usually quite established and must show history of importing beverages in order to get one of those licenses. Importers cannot sell directly to consumers, so they work with retailers, and they need to sort of forecast how much wine and apply for a quota in order to do so each year. Some of the importers do establish their own sub-distribution companies, and we're seeing that increasingly happening across a range of different sectors that previously had quite segregated supply chains. On the sort of end channel, how do consumers actually drink wine in Indonesia? Very much licensed hotels and restaurants are a key food service point, as well as bars. There is a regulation that varies by province in Indonesia. So in Bali, you can actually buy beer much more freely than you can here in Jakarta on the island of Java. There are also duty-free shops, and beer can be sold in supermarkets in some provinces, though supermarkets tend to have a wine section completely separate from the supermarket itself. So it might be a standalone, very small area, next to the supermarket or located within a mall quite separately. Thanks, Molly. Next slide. So I've touched on these and almost done. So I'll just note that, post-pandemic really is where we see the opportunity in food service. Consumers are really excited by themed nights. So we see a lot of South American cuisine, South American wine, and we'd love to see that done with an Australian flavour in the future. There, as I mentioned, we think during the pandemic there's an opportunity to enrich consumer knowledge about Australian wine, particularly those new consumers who may not be quite so aware. However, of course, there are a number of challenges that I've covered for the most part. The price sensitivity, increasing interest in halal certification and halal tourism is an interesting trend to be following, and the sort of limited growth in retail channels, which obviously has impacts during the pandemic. One other thing to note is there has been difficulties getting samples into the market during the pandemic. Pre-COVID, often people brought samples using the 2 litre per person allowance coming into the country from Singapore or from Australia. So this is something that, it hasn't actually posed a huge issue, because we have just seen quite a big reluctance of importers to take on new brands. But this is something that we're sort of looking into as how we can assist further. But unfortunately, very, very difficult at the moment. Next slide. Thanks, Molly. So in terms of takeaways, we would sort of position Indonesia to this group as a longer term diversification option for exporters, noting the impacts of the pandemic, but really important to start your research now and understand some of these trends. Important also to consider your budget availability when looking at Indonesia. Are you willing to go that extra step and do restaurant promotions, for example? And how long can you afford to do those budgets in order to see a return? I think I've mentioned a couple of times now that businesses are doing it quite tough, and now is probably more the time to prepare rather than proactively target importers. That's all from me, and I'll hand back over to you, Rod, for any questions. Happy to answer them, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you for the insights. Look, it sounds like challenging times with COVID in Indonesia at the moment, and obviously that's creating a few issues, especially in that food service channel, where most of the consumption of wine happens during going out and entertaining and so on and so forth. So sounds like it's a market there's lots of opportunities, but at the moment, it's not just consumption, but also supply chain and getting samples is also another challenge as well too. So from a tasting perspective, Hannah, I mean, obviously we can't not allowed to do any tastings at the moment because of COVID as well too. So there's obviously out of the equation as well too. From your perspective, if for wineries out there interested in entering the Indonesian market, when do you? I mean, it's very difficult to put a time frame, but do you think it's best for some of them to get the wheels in motion now, or wait until this wave, until things get a bit better? What's your perspective, Hannah?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really important to, I guess, start preparing now. So thinking about are some of those complexities of doing business in Indonesia, within your risk appetite, within your timeframes as a business. And if the answer is yes, start doing the research, understand, are you going to target tourists? Is it going to be about, when Bali reopens, that will be your key channel, or will you target high-end hotels? And some of that is really, looking at the competitive landscape, looking at what's available here. I think that, we have seen a very small number of exporters start to have their own conversations with importers. I think having a really good understanding of what your brand differentiation is in order to be able to make that first outreach to importers impactful is really important. But obviously, particularly given this second wave, to be honest, many people are personally very affected by the rise in COVID cases and very limited. There's actually 100% working from home direction in Jakarta at the moment, except for essential services. So now is not the greatest time to be reaching out for new things. But, I think people can do their research, and, we would hope, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the government wanting to reopen Bali to foreign tourists when they can. And so I think watching those timelines is important and will probably be quite relevant for anyone looking to outreach in the near future.
And tapping into the digital space is probably another good avenue as well too.
Yeah, definitely, and especially if anyone has successfully already, got a SKU or a couple of one of your varieties in market. Really staying in touch with your importer and really, asking them, what can you do to help with that ongoing branding, how their social media is going. I think that's really important in the meantime as well.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there today. We're over time. We're not going to have time for discussions from a importer or a specialist in Indonesia, as we unfortunately we've already gone way over time. So interesting discussions, lots of learnings. Again, I just wanted to thank everyone, not only the Australian companies, wineries, everyone online today, but also Austrade, Wine Australia, all our experts, in-market experts. Thank you so much. We will provide your details to everyone that participated today. And look, I think everyone here in Australia, we're looking forward to when we can travel again and see you in the flesh and see you in person, in market, hopefully one of these days. But thank you again, and do connect to the Wine Connect platform. Great opportunity. Don't miss out on that window as per Stuart's presentation. And in the meantime, stay safe and take care. Thank you very much.